Hello guys, welcome back to my channel. This is part 91 of ASP.NET MVC tutorial. In this video, we will discuss creating a custom remote attribute and overriding IsValid method. This is continuation to part 90. Please watch part 90 before proceeding with this video. Out of the box, remote attribute only works when JavaScript is enabled. If the end user disables JavaScript, then the validation does not work. This is because remote attribute requires JavaScript to make an asynchronous AJAX call to the server-side validation method. As a result, the user will be able to submit the form by passing the validation in place. That is why it is always important to have server-side validation. And to make server-side validation work when JavaScript is disabled, there are two steps. There are two options. Option 1, adding model validation error dynamically within the controller action method. And we have discussed this in part 90. But then delegating the responsibility of validating model data to a controller action method violates separation of concern principle within MVC. It should not be the responsibility of a controller. It should not be the responsibility of a controller. Of a controller action method to validate model data. It should be the responsibility of the model itself. And model should be using validation attribute to validate model data. And if you remember in the previous session, to validate this username, validate this username property, we used remote attribute. But this remote attribute works only when JavaScript is enabled. And if you disable JavaScript, then it is not working. So in this video, we are going to create a custom remote attribute that is going to inherit from the remote attribute, from this remote attribute that is already existed within .NET framework. And this custom remote attribute that we are going to create should provide validation both when JavaScript is enabled as well as when it is disabled. And the first step toward achieving that is to create a class file. So let's flip to the Solution Explorer, and then first let's add a folder, and let's name it common. So go to the Solution Explorer and right click the projects, add a new folder, name it as common. So all our common application code is going to be residing within this folder. Let's add a class file. Let's add a class file now. Add a class file now. and let's name it remote client server. So we want to extend the capability, by creating a custom remote attribute. So remote client server is going to be the name of the class file. Because this remote attribute that we are going to create provides, validation on the client side when JavaScript is enabled. If JavaScript is disabled, it is still going to do the validation on the server side when we submit the form. So let's click add. And it is a good practice to end, an attribute class name with the word attribute. So let's call this class as remote client server attributes. Remote client server attribute. And this class is going to inherit from remote attribute. And this class, remote client server attribute, is going to inherit from remote attribute class. And this remote attribute class is present in system.web.mvc that we have already there. System.web.mvc. And we need two other namespace as well. So let's bring them in system.componentModel. System.componentModel dot data annotation. And we need system.reflection. In a bit, we will be writing some reflection code. So we want this class to inherit from, we want this class, remote client server attribute, to inherit from remote attribute class, because we are going to extend, that remote, the already existing remote attribute. All right. So all we are going to do here is override IsValid method that is present within this base class remote attribute. So if I right click on that and go to definition, there is IsValid method. I'm going to where is the IsValid method? There is the IsValid method. As you can see, there is the IsValid method. I'm going to override that IsValid method. So once we type override, so go back to your remote client server. So once we type override, and once I press space, there are two overloaded versions of IsValid. I am going to override this overload version. So double click this. Okay. So I'm going to override this overload version. So delete this. Now I'm going to write some code here, some reflection code. Basically, once I typing that, I will explain that code. So first of all, I am going to get controller, and a bit I will explain why we need to get hold of the controller. Okay. And to get the controller name, I am going to use reflection. So this assembly class is this assembly class is present in system.reflection namespace. So assembly.get executing. So assembly.get executing assembly. And within the executing assembly, get all the types. Get all the types. So basically, all the classes inherit all the classes, interfaces, and structure, and from those types, let's actually this means dots this this to the next line, this to the next line. I want one type where the type name, let's convert that to lowercase. I want one type. One type where the type name where the type name Let's convert that to a lowercase. Let's convert that to a lowercase. So the type name, so the type name so the type name should be equal to, I'm going to use a string dot format. I'm going to use string dot format. String dot format function. Format function here. So a placeholder, and then the word controller. And within this placeholder, I am going to get the controller name. And within this placeholder, I'm going to get the controller name. And how can I get the controller name? I can use route data. I can use route data. So get the controller name. And how can I get the controller name? I can use route data. So get the controller name from route data and then convert that to string. And then convert that to string. So the controller name, will basically be replaced within this, placeholder, within this placeholder. Okay, and then the entire output of this string dot format and then the entire output of this string dot format, convert that to lower. Convert that to lower. Because we are comparing the type name. Because we are comparing the type name, by converting it to a lowercase. So we need to convert this So we need to convert this to lowercase as well. So basically, let's try and understand what this piece of code is trying to do here. So first of all, what we are doing, we are creating custom remote attribute. And how do we use this remote attribute? And how do we use this remote attribute? So if you remember from the previous session, so within the user class, notice the username property is notice the username property is decorated with remote attribute. And when we use a remote attribute, the first parameter here is the name of the method, which contains the validation logic, and this is the name of the controller within which that method is present. And here we have the error message, and here we have the error message. Okay, now after we have done creating this after we have done creating this custom remote attribute, people are going to use that. In the same way as we are using remote attribute. So there is still going to specify the method which contains the validation logic and the name of the controller and the error message. So at this time, when at the time of designing this remote attribute, we don't know what will the name of the controller be, what will name of that method be. That is why we are using reflection code here. That is why we are using the reflection code here. So we are using reflection to find out the name of the controller and the name of the method which contains the validation logic. Okay, so basically what is going to happen when we compile this project? Okay, so here the name of the project is, so here the name of the project is MVC demo. So when we compile this project here, if you look at this home controller, home controller, for example, home controller is nothing but a class, right? So this class will be compiled into the assembly. Okay, so the class and the method And the methods, everything that is present within this project will be compiled into this MVC demo project. And when we run, and when we run, and when we run, which assembly is getting executed, which assembly is going, which assembly is getting executed? Nothing but this, nothing but this MVC demo assembly. And this assembly is going to contain the validation method as well as the controller, in which that validation method is present. So basically both the controller and the method are going to be residing within this executing assembly. Okay, within this executing assembly. Okay, and that is the reason, and that is the reason and that is the reason why look at this. I'm using this I'm using this assembly. I'm using this assembly class, and this has got the static method get executing assembly, which will basically return on this MVC demo assembly. And on that assembly, I am invoking the gets type method. So gets types. So what is this method going to do? It is going to return all the types, all the types within the assembly. And when we say types, what do we mean? We mean classes, structures, interfaces, all the types basically. But we are not interested in all the types. We are only interested in a controller whose name matches within the controller that is present in the route. For example, when I am on the create, when we are at this URL, so we are present within the home. We are present in the home. I mean, we are invoking the home controller and the create action method. So I want the home controller because that controller is going to contain the method which contain the validation logic. Let's say, okay, so this is just an example. So basically we are going to get the name of the controller from the route data, and similarly we are going to get the action method also from route data. All right, so we are getting that name. So we are getting that name, and then look at that from route data, We only get the word home. We don't get the home controller. And that is the reason why we are appending that word. And that is the reason why we are appending that word there, controller. Okay. And then we are converting both of them to lower cases. And then comparing. So if there is a controller, within the ties, then give me that controller. That is what we are doing here. We are getting type. We are getting type. We are getting type of that controller. Okay, all right. So once we have the controller, if that controller is not equal to null, so once we have the controller, so if that controller so once we have the controller, if that controller is not equal to null, what is the next step? We need to get the action method which contains the validation logic. Okay, so to get that action method is obviously going to reside in a controller. So I'm going to use the controller. I'm going to use that controller which we have just retrieved. And look at this controller is of type. And look at this controller is of type type. And this type class has got this method. And this type class has got this method. Get methods function. So which is basically going to return all the method which are going to be present within the controller. Okay. And if you look at this get methods, what it is returning back? It is returning an array of method info. It is returning an array of method info object. But we are not interested in all the methods. We are only interested in the method which contains the validation logic. So get method dot first or default. So get method dot first or default And we need to specify the name of the method. So let's call this maybe method such that method dot name. Such that method dot name. Again, let's convert that to lower for comparison. To lower for comparison. Equal to, how am I going to get the name of the action method? Again, let's use route data. So let's and here let's specify action, and let's here specify action. Okay, so return me that action method. Okay, and since we are using first or default, we are only going to get one method info, object back. So let's store it in a reference variable of type method info, of type and maybe let's call that action method info. Let's call it maybe action. Okay, and if action is not equal to null, and if action is not equal to null, okay, so far what we did do, we got the controller, which contains the method, and the method itself. Next step is to create an instance of this. Controller, and then invoke this, and then invoke the method, this method, and invoke this method, the method. Okay, so to create an instance of this controller, So first of all, let's create a variable of type object. So here instance, so here is instance is of type object. Because we don't know whether if it is going to be home controller or if it is student controller, employee controller. We don't know the type. That is why we are using reflection to retrieve the controller. And that is why we can't hard code here. Whether if it is going to be an object of type home controller or student controller, employee controller. That is the reason we are using the instance type as object. Instance type as object. Okay, and to create an instance of the class that we are going to get, I'm going to use the class activator. I'm going to use the class activator. And this class has got a method create instance. And this method, we just need to pass the type. And in this method, we need to pass the and to this method, we just need to pass the type. So what is this method going to do? So what is this method going to do? It is going to create an instance of that class, and then it is going to store in this reference variable. Okay, so we have an instance now. The next step is to invoke this action method. Okay. Now, obviously, I cannot say instance dot. So obviously, I cannot say instance dot action. Okay, so how are we going to invoke this action method? So how are we going to invoke this method? Again, so action dot invoke. So action dot invoke. action dot invoke. So I'm using invoke function on that method object info. On that method info object. And look at this, obviously when we have a customer object, and then let's say for example that customer object has got save customer method. So and if it is an instance method, you have to create an instance of that customer class. So customer c1 equals new customer and c1 dot save customer details. You know, you invoke the method on the instance of that class. So similarly, if you want to invoke a controller action method, you need an instance of that controller, and that instance is right here. And then I am invoking this function, and then I am invoking that function. So we need to pass, look at this, to this invoke method we need to pass the instance. We need to pass the instance of the controller as well. And then a method will have parameter. So if you look at this validation method is username available that we have, it has got a parameter. So we need to pass that parameter. We need to pass that parameters. We need to pass that parameter value. Means this method is username available that we have. It has got a parameter. Okay, so we need to pass that parameter value when we invoke, the action method. So that is the next parameter. And how we are going to get that value? Look at this is valid. Look at this is valid. Look at this is valid method is receiving that value. Is receiving that value. So I am simply going to pass that here. And if you look at that, the type here, it is expecting that to be of type object array. Type, it is simply going to, and so I'm simply going to pass that here. And if you look at the type here, it is expecting that to be of type object array. So I'm going to create an object array and then pass the value. So I'm going to create an object array. Create an object array. And then pass the value. And then pass the value that is coming into this function. That is coming into this function. Okay. So obviously when we invoke that function, that function, look at this. When we invoke this function, what is going to happen? It is going to return some result back. It is going to return some result back. So similarly, when we invoke the function, we are going to get some result back. So I'm going to store that in an variable. So I'm going to store that in an variable of type object. And again, let's call it maybe response. The name of the variable is response of type object. Okay, so if once we get the response, so that is this function is going to return something back, but then for the remote attribute, perform validation on the client side, it should return JSON result. So basically, I'm going to check if response is of type JSON result. So basically, I'm going to check if response is of type JSON result. So if response is JSON result, then what am I going to do? I'm going to typecast this response to JSON result. So if response is JSON result, then what am I going to do? I'm going to typecast this response to JSON result. And then I'm going to get the data. And then I'm going to get the data out of that. So whatever data that method returns, and look at the return type of data again. And look at the return type of data. Again, object. Again, it returns an object type. So let's store it in a variable of type object. Variable of type object. And let's call this JSON data. Okay. Now this method, which contains the validation logic, which contains the validation logic, what type of data should it return? It should return a Boolean data, because if we want the validation to succeed, this method is going to return true. If we want the validation to fail, this method is going to return false. So basically it has to be JSON data, because we want the validation to be done on the client side as well. Okay. So another check that I'm going to make. So another check that I'm going to make, if this JSON data is Boolean, this JSON data is Boolean. So if it is Boolean, then what we need to do? Typecast to of type Boolean. So if it is Boolean, then what we need to do? Typecast that to of type Boolean. So I am going to typecast this JSON data to Boolean type. So when I typecast it to Boolean type, if it returns out to be true, so if this JSON data is true, then what we want to do? Look at this. Look at this. What is this IsValid method returning? What is this IsValid method returning? It is returning validation result. It is returning validation result back. Okay, so basically we want to return validation result now. So if it is true, then I am going to say valid return validation result dot success. Because if the validation method that we have invoked validation method that we have invoked, if that returns true, then what does it mean? The validation logic has successfully passed the validation. So in that case, we want to return a success method, a success message, a success message. And at that point, the validation passes and the form will be submitted. On the other hand, if it has not returned a true, if this data is not, if this data is not true, then what we want to do? Again, the return type is validation result. So here I am going to create an instance of this validation result. So here I am going to create an instance of this validation result object. And then you can specify the error message. And then you can specify the error message. So I don't want to hard code any error message here, but then when we use this So when we use this custom remote attribute, we are going to specify, we are going to specify, look at the way we are using it. We are going to specify the error message as well. Look at the way we are using it. We are going to specify the error message as well. So whatever the error message the user is going to specify, let's use that error. And to get access to that error message, I am going to use this dot. I'm going to use this dot error message. Okay. So that's it. We have overridden IsValid method. But there are lots of condition here. Look at this. We are saying if controller is not equal to null, then go ahead and get the action. Action method. If that action method is not equal to null, then create an instance of the controller, execute the action, and then once we have the response, if that response is JSON result, then do this. So if these conditions are not met, if any of these conditions are not met, then obviously it will break out of that if condition. In that case, in that case, what do we want to do? In that case, what we want to do? You can specify whatever you want your method to do. For example, let's say here I have specified within the user class, for example, the controller name as the home 678. And do we have 678 controller? Do we have 678 controller here? We don't have it. So if we don't find the controller, then do you want the validation to succeed, or do you want the validation to fail? That is what we are going to write here. And similarly, if the action method that we have specified is not found, if I say something like that, then what should happen? that action method is not there within the home controller. Okay, so should the validation fail or should the validation succeed? Okay, so basically for now, so basically for now, let's say we want the validation to succeed. Basically for now, let's say we want the validation to succeed. If you know the controller is not found, or the action method is not found, or if the return data is not JSON data, okay, or if the or it is JSON data but it is not a Boolean data, okay, in all those cases, if any of these if condition are not met, by default the validation is going to succeed. If you don't want the validation to succeed, then probably can return a new validation like this, like this. In that case, the validation will fail. We will look at that actually in action when we are done writing this attribute. All right. So that's it, overriding the IsValid method. The other thing that we need to do is look at this. At the moment, if I try to use remote, let's actually build this. But before that, why we are having this error here, IsValid method. It is saying that validate the specified value with respect to the current validation attribute. Remote error is remote client server attribute is valid. Object validation context, not all code path returns a value. Why is it so? So basically you need to, so remote client server attribute is valid object. So not all code path return a value. It happens because your method signature promises to always return a validations result. But there are execution paths where nothing is returned. Why the error occurs? In your IsValid method, if controller is equal to null, you exit if block without returning anything. If action is equal to null, same issue. If response is JSON result, but JSON data is not a Boolean, you fall through without returning. Essentially, the compilers see that some branches do not end with a return. How to fix it? You need to ensure every possible path returns a validation result. The simplest fix is to add a default return at the end of the method. Means here you need to type return new validation result this error message. This error message Validation failed. Okay. Now the error gone. Now the error has gone. Okay. By default, the validation is going to succeed. If you don't want the validation to succeed, then probably you can return a new validation like this, But since there was an error which we have removed by writing this return new validation result, this dot error message validation failed. Okay. In that case, validation failed. We will look at that actually in action when we are done writing this attribute. All right, so that's it, overriding the isValid method. The other thing that we need to do is look at this. At the moment, if I try to use remote, let's actually build this. So build succeeded. Now I can use our remote attribute, the custom remote. I can use our remote attribute, the custom remote attribute, that we have created. And notice that this attribute is present in mvc.common. And notice that this attribute is present in mvc demo.common namespace. So if we have to use it here, so if we have to use it here, we have to bring that namespace in. So here it is already there, MVC demo common namespace. And then we should have remote client server. Okay. And look at this, I only have two constructor. I have only two constructor. Once constructor does not take look at that two overloaded version. I'm not seeing it here. One construction does not take any parameter. Why it is not showing the okay, I'm using attribute also. So I don't use this attribute. No, still it is showing that. Okay. So it is, there are two constructor. One construction does not take look at that two overloaded version of this constructor. One constructor does not take any parameter. The other take the name parameter. Okay, but then I want to be able to specify the name of the controller, the name of the validation method, and the error message. But I don't have a constructor that can do that. That basically because we have not implemented them within our remote client server attribute. So let's go ahead and implement them. Let's minimize this function. Let's minimize this function. Okay, so public remote client server attribute. So public client server attribute, and what I am going to do here is invoke the base class. Invoke the base class. Invoke the base class constructor that I am interested in. And if you look at the base class, what is the base class for the remote client server attribute? Remote attribute. And if you look at this base class, look at that, there are several overloaded version. Look at that. There are several overloaded constructor for the remote attribute. So I'm going to basically first invoke this overloaded constructor. This overloaded constructor, and to invoke that we need to pass route name. So what I am going to do here is I am going to specify route name. And then I am going to pass this to the base class. We have already done this. Base class constructor. Okay, and similarly, let's make a copy of that. We have copy and pasted it here. Now I'm going to invoke, I want this version. I want this version of the constructor as well, where the end user can simply specify just the action name and the controller name. Okay, so string, let's call this action. And the controller name. And then obviously we need to pass them to the base class constructor. So action controller. Action controller. And I want to have another constructor as well. So we have implemented this constructor and I want to implement this as well, where it takes action name, the controller name and the and the area name. Okay, so here I am going to pass string area name. By the way, for these parameter, you can give any meaningful name you want. Okay, I just show the same name because it will be more readable. The code will be more readable. All right. So we are done implementing the constructor as well. Now, if we go back to the user class, if we go back to the user class, now if you go back to the user class and look at this, the moment I open up the parenthesis, look at this. Now I have three version of the constructor, but I am going to use this overloaded constructor where we can specify the action method that contains the validation logic. The controller that contain the method and error message. Okay, so I'm going to copy this and pass it as the argument for this remote attribute. So copy this and paste it here. We have got rid of that early remote attribute. So now we are using our constructor, our custom remote client server, our custom remote. And at the moment, JavaScript is disabled on my browser. But let's go back to our home controller. And if you remember in the previous session, we have delegated the responsibility of validating model data to the controller action method by including this logic here. So I'm going to comment that because we don't want our controller action method to be responsible for validating model data. So I'm going to build this now. So build this. And let's reload this view. So build succeeded. So let's reload this. And let's reload this view. Here you can see the JavaScript is disabled. Okay. So let's reload this view. So at the moment JavaScript is disabled. Look at this. JavaScript was blocked on this. JavaScript is blocked. So JavaScript is blocked on this page. So page has reloaded, and within the database we already have test username. Look at that, we don't get client side validation. So if I type test and take away the cursor, look at that, we don't get client-side validation. That is basically because JavaScript is disabled. But when I click create, we should get the validation error message. Look at that. We get the username already in use. Okay. So this is the server-side validation. So this is the server-side validation. Now let's enable JavaScript and see if the client-side validation work as expected. But before we do that, one thing that I want to do is look at this. When we use this remote attribute, when we use this remote attribute within our user class, we are specifying this as the function name. Let's say, for example, I am using, 1. At the end, is username available 1. But in the home controller, do we have is username available 1? We don't have it. So obviously the method will not be found. So in that case, what is going to happen? The validation is going to succeed because it returns validation success. Let's actually look at that. So let's build this solution. But I have already done it here. So it will not show the success. I'll tell you why. I have already, let me show you. Here you can see this one. But we will see it again. Let's see what does happen if I specify this here is username available 1. So build the solution, build succeeded. So in that case, what is going to happen? The validation is going to succeed because it returns validation success. Let's actually look at that. Means if I specify is username available 1 here, as you can see. In that case, what is going to happen? The validation is going to succeed because it returns validation success. Let's actually look at that. We have built our solution. Let's refresh, go to the browser and refresh it. And let's enter test. And click create. So it says username already in use. Why is this so? Because we have specified it here. You can see here we have written new validation result. This error message, validation failed. In that case, if we write this. So there is no chance if we change the name of the method of the action method. The default behavior, is to make the validation failed. Okay. Because it not find the action method and default behavior is going, validation is going to succeed. Okay. All right. Now let's enable client side validation. But before we do that, let's correct that name. So let's correct that name. So within our user class, we want that to be is username available, not one, is user available. Okay, is username available. Let's build this solution. Build succeeded. Let's reload this view. And let's enable client-side validation. Let's go to setting, means we need to go to setting. Search JavaScript. Side setting. Scroll down. Here is the JavaScript. Click this and click site can use the JavaScript. Okay. We have enabled the JavaScript now. So go back to the browser, reload this view again. JavaScript is enabled now. And as I type test, look at this. We get validation error. Right? Right away, we get a validation error right away. Username already in use. So the custom remote attribute that we have just created so the custom remote attribute that we have just created is able to perform both client-side validation as well as server-side validation. So the validation is done on the client side when a JavaScript is enabled. If we disable the JavaScript, it is still able to do validation on server side. In fact, if somebody asks you in an interview, can you give me a practical example of where have you used reflection in your project? You can give this as an example to implement custom remote attribute. We had to get the controller name and the action method. using reflection. So obviously, a very good example for the practical application of reflection. All right. So guys, that's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day. But before that, if you familiar with this coding, if you are familiar with this coding was used in Visual Studio 2013 or 15, and there was a condition at that time. We were not using this line here at that time. Why? Because there was no error. If we remove this error, if this line, then you can see the error here. Not all code paths returns a value. Okay. To remove this error, we have to use this line here. But in the 2013 and 15, there was no error when we are not using this line. Okay, this line. There is the slight change in 2022 Visual Studio Editor Enterprise Edition. In Visual Studio 2022, there is a slight change. We have to use this return, this line, okay, to remove the error of this IsValid method. Okay, thank you guys for watching this. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.